Hey, what's up? You're listening to Why We Roll, a tabletop RPG game design podcast featuring Chris Pickett
Hey, that's me.
and myself, Wythe Marschall. It's made by the Stillfleet Studio, and we always try to have on a really awesome guest every time, and we have an awesome guest for you today. It's Graham Gentz. Am I saying your last name right? I
You
think
sure are. You got it.
I
That's
got
right.
it.
You
Okay.
got
Yes,
it.
we
It's the same
succeeded.
sound. It's the same sound twice, like a superhero.
Yeah, that's true. Wow, yeah, you do have that going for you.
Uh
Clark
huh. Peter
Kent, Peter
Parker,
You do.
Clark Kent.
Parker.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's
Any
Steven
me,
Sandwich, my
Graham
favorite
Gans.
superhero.
We're all peas in a pod.
Bruce Bane. Uh,
Bruce Bane. I love Bruce
yeah,
Bane.
he's the best.
Bruce Bane killed his own parents. That's messed up.
Yeah, that's the
Uh,
twist.
I really like bats.
Yeah. I was born in the darkness. All right, anyway.
uh,
Um, hello, Graham. How are you?
I'm very good. I had a really awesome weekend because I came from my favorite con ever, which is Metatopia. I've been doing it for a few years now. It is only the second year coming back since the Pando, and it is about half the size of what it was. It used to be about 750, now it's about 350. But it's still just there's really nothing like it because it's play testing, it's design. You're playing other people's games, and then you're going to the lobby and you're sitting down and you're talking to people for hours about ideas. And so it's just like the most creatively charging thing that I get to do all year. It's just really, really exciting.
Oh, it sounds incredible. That's what we all want out of a con, but
Uh-huh, yeah.
rarely
You're
can
not
find.
overwhelmed. You do it at your own pace. Plus, like, every game you knew is new, and they're short little 2-hour slots, which I've
yeah.
gotten really, really into because, I on Discord, my handle is Graham Gens Loves to Playtest, which is true. And then outside of Metatopia, I'll get stuck in like a 4 or 6 hour playtest of something that's like an adventure or something that's just like very much 5e or another system that I know very well. If you don't even have to squint that hard. But at Metatopia, I sign up for the weirdest stuff that I can, either in pitch or mechanical premise. And then even if like it's an unpleasant experience, I'm out of there in 90 minutes, which is fabulous. And you can still think and give feedback and give a compliment sandwich and then move on. And
Yeah.
it's all I think every part a very beneficial experience.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. I just got back from Flag, Finger Lakes Area Game Con. A little shout out in Ithaca, where studio member Aaron is. But yeah, we were just saying before we recorded, Graham, we got to go to Metatopia. I wish it wasn't the same weekend because Metatopia looks
Yeah,
amazing.
yeah. So
I hear good things.
flags. How many flags are there?
It's
Just
just one flag, two
flag.
G's.
Yeah,
Oh, okay, great. Just like me, 2 Gs.
Yeah.
So yeah, just get him to adjust it because there was a similar problem this year because my other very favorite con, which is largely for like the community and cultural portion of it, is Save Against Fear, which is all about mental health professionals who use games as part of therapy or clinicians, other parts. So some of the days are them getting professional hours, and then the exhibitor hall could be the most informal space I've ever seen. Even a con I like, there's a certain frenetic energy when you're there for what it is. But
Yeah.
when you're at Save, it feels like a family picnic in the best possible way. People existing, which I've never felt, even in Metatopia, I've never felt before. And they happen to be at the same. It's in York, Pennsylvania, and so I would be there if I
yeah,
could. Morristown's kind of in my backyard as well, Morristown, New Jersey. So,
yeah.
uh,
I don't know. I don't know. I've never been to Saving Its Fear, but same thing. I've heard great things, and I would love to
oh, I
go.
adore it.
We should
Oh, that's
make sure that
wonderful.
these events somehow don't happen on the same days. It's also funny they all happened right after the election, so it's very weird because it was like we're trying to
Yeah,
get pumped, get people to
yeah.
sign up
All
and play
all
games, which
the
they
social
did.
media were like, "What's it
Yeah,
going to be like? Is it going to be weird?" And it
no, it wasn't
wasn't.
weird.
It was
Yeah,
pretty good. I occasionally would talk to somebody and be like, "How are you doing?" And it was an emotional check-in, and at
Yeah.
most, and because a lot of these games tend to be kind of experimental or weird or sometimes intense, there's the issue of that, or LARPs that have very particular kinds of subject matter. But it was immediately so I think refreshing to everybody to be in such a creative, communicative space that it
yeah,
did a lot of good.
yeah, totally. That's awesome. Well, maybe you can share some of the games you played that were fun, also. But definitely, we're interested in having you on to talk about your own games. And I take it you played, I think you said 3 or so that you were working
Yeah,
on.
so I tend to bring one game per year, and so the game that I brought last year is going to enter into backer kit early next year. It's called Love for the Love Gods. It's Cabin of the Woods for Hallmark movies, and since then, as I was finishing the last 20%, I don't know how it works for you all when you're making projects. You usually start to accumulate procrastination projects, the ones that are like, there's a little bit of a shine on it. And so you're like, I'll just do this for a weekend, or I'll just do it for an afternoon. And so slowly but surely, my next major project was getting less and less. And my two other very stupid projects started looking more and more like something that like would be playable. And the unfortunate thing was that they both started as names. And so when people would ask me what I was working on, I'd say the name and immediately get a laugh. It was a very bad example of positive reinforcement where I'm like, I should make that. Let's not work on my big project. And so I couldn't decide. And I said, you know what, let's do something different. Let's do 3 games and do a single playtest of each and bring them. And shockingly, it worked. I put a lot of pressure on myself and it paid off. So there was a lot to talk about. And then I played lots of everybody else's games. I love fitting in all these 2-hour play tests and then seeing people in the lobby, which again is like very intimate. I call it LobbyCon at about 10 o'clock. It's just one very comfortable, big open space and everyone's just sitting around. Very famous people who are been your heroes for years, people who are about to become your heroes, people who are about to become friends for life. It's a wild space.
That's amazing. So what were the other 2 titles that you brought to the convention this year?
Well, that game I didn't
Metatopia?
bring because I brought it last year. So it's actually 3 more ones. Whoa! So the first one I brought was Borkborg, where you play as puppet chefs in a world that's dying.
I was going to ask if it had anything to do with puppets.
But it is not in the Morkborg system because I generally don't write hacks. It's more like a vibe, and then I write a lot of GM-less games and a lot of like storytelling games, so it has that energy. It's really a game about contrast. How do you build contrast? How do you zip between tones that seem disparate? Is kind of what the thesis of the game is, beyond like getting the door open with the name Borkborg. And then the second game I brought is Kids Are Bikes. Kids Are Bikes is a game about being a kid that turns into a bike or a bike that turns into a kid or both. And also, same thing, it's not a pre-existing system, and instead it is my mechanical commentary on genre and again, trying to find similarities between things. And most of my games I refer to as buckets. I'm very anti-canonical. I absolutely hate canon in general because I think it takes away from the agency of the players at the table. And also what I'm most interested in at a role-playing table is when ownership occurs and players are high-fiving and hugging and walking away and being like, this only could have happened here with us, right? And so Kids Are Bikes is taking that to an even further degree than most of my games tend to, which is I ask people to bring the buckets and then they fill them up and then we talk about it and then you make a game out of it. So the consistent thing is that you're always kids that turn into bikes or bikes that turn into kids. And then the idea is, what exactly is that? And I don't answer it. I give you the tools to answer it, and then the game emerges. My goal is that every game will be different, which, like Under the Atom Strangely, my last game was kind of similar in that way, trying to get dream logic and player tonal clash to create unique experiences in a storytelling way.
Can you say a little more about when someone has an idea for a kid turning into a bike or a bike turning into a kid? Are you giving them some mechanical constraints or any constraints at all? Like what is the way in which it functions as a game, or is it more of just sort of a prompt or series of prompts, almost like a journaling game in that
It's not a journaling game. I generally don't write journaling games because that's my background is in writing. There's some bits of really brilliant solo games that have come out that are very difficult for me to like get into more than just once, because I look at them and I say, oh, this is what I do all the time, or this is what I went to school for, right? I like the idea of the prompts. There tends to be sort of thick, tactile, language-focused mechanics that I use, but I hardly ever use dice. And then it's usually about I love writing and playing GM-less games because, again, that implies a lack of ownership at the table. Even when I play games with a facilitator, I like the hierarchy to be as thin as possible. It's really about a guiding thing. And so when I write a game, it's this fantasy that like I can communicate an idea and then not be there presently, and then that people can take these ideas and make a thing out of it. It's a cookbook, right? You know, the game is not the thing. And so there's like 3 pillars in Kids Are Bikes. The first one is generating tones and ideas, and I put it in a big triangle. And so the idea is that you have these corners of different either genres or ideas. So it's like Transformers at the top. And then I even break it open and I'm like, okay, you could put like a musical genre, like ska. I don't know, maybe ska is in the bottom left. And then you could do another movie. It could be a movie. It could be, you know, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles or Animorphs. Maybe it's the color blue. I don't know. And so you have that. And then people have their own separate triangles. And you put your little dot where in the triangle you want to be. Are we like mostly this thing with like supporting bits of those, or do you push it all the way? We're 100% pure ska in this thing, and then the second half is then asking what people do. You kind of place all them together. You make this little zone, so you have this little like fish that's shared on everyone else's choices that like is glowing, that you kind of highlight. And then you say, okay, well, what is the fundamental parts of ska, and what is the fundamental parts of Godzilla versus Mothra, which is one I had that somebody suggested for my play of Kids Art Bikes this weekend.
Nice.
And then the final stage is enacting those things. So using the deconstruction and the tone and giving players the tools to create story and create conflict and find resolutions. So
I would love to see a game of Kids Are Bikes where you have to skank in order to transform, or...
Oh, that's what it was. So
Yeah.
trying to remember my triangle. The top was Sailor Moon, the bottom left was ska, and the bottom right was Godzilla versus Mothra. And so it was mostly ska and Sailor Moon with kind of a supportive, maybe like roughly... It's mathematical, but because I make this zone and I'm asking people to do it, it ends up being, I flip it around. It's like, you're not actually asking what is 80% ska, even though that's like the premise and the joke kind of wrapped in. Instead, it's what are even the boring things you notice now that we've made this shape in the middle of the triangle, of which it's like it's mostly ska and Sailor Moon with Godzilla versus Mothra coming in too. So yeah, it was like a bike didn't want to be a bike anymore, and then heard the real big fish cover of Take on Me, and then transformed into a kid, because that was what the nature of ska was. And this is all player driven. It's me asking these questions, and then people saying stuff, and then all yelling and high fiving. Because again, it's not me. I haven't made this game; they did. I just add to like what is ska, and then from that is birthed a game that I don't have ownership over, which for me is glorious.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, that is a wild premise, but I do love, as Vex is pointing out in the chat, you know, mixing genres as a sort of mechanic and as a basis for a game, I think is really, really generative in general. And I love how much you're focused on sort of player agency and encouraging people to be creative.
Most of my games all kind of have this as an underlying sort of philosophy. I started playing role-playing games at a very young age, and I never ever stopped. People have this thing about, oh, I used to play D&D in high school. You know, I would really love to get back to it. That was never me. I never ever stopped. And if there weren't people playing with, I was saying, humor me. And I get bored of systems and was finding others, and, you know, through middle school and high school and college, like, you know, trying to look for things and share before I stumbled backwards into subcultures where people go to cons and share things and are human beings saying, like, this is a new idea I have. It wasn't just me in a bubble being like, wait, Fiasco does what? And like that blowing my mind in 2010. And then grabbing everyone I could find and being like, there's no GM, there's no dice. Look
There's
at
no
this.
GM. There are dice in Fiasco, but they don't really work well.
The second edition having cards like makes 100% sense, but it doesn't have the montage at the end, which makes me very mad.
Yeah. This gets to our sort of traditional second question, which is, you know, how did you get into the game? I will say I definitely want to come back to some of these themes of community, not only just because you and I just came back from cons that we really enjoyed, and we were sort of sharing about how awesome cons are in general and how important they are for game designers because of the reason you just cited. You kind of cross-fertilize ideas, and it's not about competing with other indie designers. All the indie designers are kind of just tend to be generally cool and, you know, interested in creation and collaboration, and you know, it is generally a good time. Safety caveats about COVID and such aside. But I want to come back to that, and I want to come back to community making also in an age when people are probably thinking about that in light of the election that just happened at the time of this recording. But before we do that, how did you become a game designer? Walk us through, because a lot of us, I think, went from D&D to dissatisfaction or just like boredom with that and trying other games. Not everyone becomes a game designer, and also people take different pathways. But that's something I think Chris and I have had a lot of fun, like asking people and kind of hearing some of these patterns and some of the inspiration. So I'm curious. Fiasco has come up before. I don't know, Chris, if anything else jumps out with this kind of hero's journey of game design. But
I mean, it feels like lately it seems like it goes one of two ways, which is kind of what you were saying, Graham, where it's like I picked this up in middle school, high school, I played a bit, I stopped, I got back into it, or just never stopped. Or it is folks who, like, in the last 10 years or so have listened to a podcast and was like, that sounds dope, I want to try that, and then got into any number of like weird systems from there. Weird being a good thing, by the way.
Oh yeah, love weird, because weird implies something is normal, and normal is a moving goalpost. So yeah. Weird means that you have something to say, and I've always appreciated that. There's a lot of ways to answer your question, and I love that Chris has brought up the podcast stuff, because for me that's been this fascinating thing. There's been a feedback loop of your kind of Critical Role and Critical Role adjacent properties, and the way the kind of LA Hollywood stuff has affected the way that the marketing has gone. And, Wizards got eaten by Hasbro several decades ago, and kind of was on and off. But because this cross-fertilization happened, all of a sudden it's more popular than ever. And so for a few years there, when I was working booths at conventions for indie games, again, like not any of these things, people would come up and ask me if I sold Critical Role. They'd be like, do you have Critical Role? And I'm like, it was sort of the Kleenex tissue idea. But that it happened more than once. And for me, that's a direct reflection of what's going on. In addition to when I am going to stores now and running events and being like, I'm not going to charge ticket price, and I just want to like teach these things. It's another joy I have writing GM-less games. It means I get to teach a bunch of tables at once, and then Homer Simpson into the bushes behind me. I don't have to be, again, like I hate this image, the like steepled fingers behind the GM screen, and the idea that like the players are empty vessels, the story flows downward. If I wrote those kinds of games, then I could run one table, or I would pay people, hopefully pay your GMs to run my game, right? But instead, I give people the tools, and then all of a sudden, you look around at a room, and everyone is like doing the thing that you want them to do, which is make stuff.
I will. Well, let's come back to your answer of your path journey, but I did want to shout out. Came back from Flag, Aaron, who's on our team, another game designer, and myself, and we were jamming on and off. But we scheduled it this time, so instead of jamming at the same time at all, we were always jamming at the same table. So we tried to militate against that with our sort of medium crunch, or rules bright is one term that I like from Fari RPGs.
That's cool.
The kind of games we make. So we always had two GMs, and one of us didn't really know what was going on. So we're the antagonists, but like we don't know when we're going to be called in. And we don't know how big of a role we're playing, and there's a lot of freedom to just like start making stuff up. And that I think helps also with players where they're sort of like don't know who to look at in a positive way, because they're like, oh, there's like a rules referee, but then the squirrel who's trying to kill me is actually this guy. And then they're looking at each other, and it sort of had that feeling of like, yeah, just everyone make it up, right? Like anyone can make it up. So I think in addition to GM-less and like all these things you're citing, I think there's so many ways to sort of begin playing with that traditional you've paid to be here and be told a story, but like that's problems with that potentially. It's not a podcast, right?
Endlessly. Like even like the opening gambit of it as a concept I find deeply troubling, and I hate it. I think it makes bad games, and I think it makes bad culture, and like you could go off on either one for any number of reasons, but that's the starting point. If that's your starting point, then we need to reevaluate. Like, I hate the Forgotten Realms. The Forgotten Realms should be forgotten. You know what I'm saying? Hashtag forget the Forgotten Realms.
Whoa, you heard it here first.
That's right. Spice. That's right. We could get it off big.
I would wear that shirt.
I
would wear that shirt.
Why we roll.
Yeah.
This is why we roll, though.
This is why we roll.
How and why.
So Graham, how did you go from playing D&D type games, playing Fiasco, trying stuff out, to making your own? What was first? What was most? What like led you there along with cons? I think you mentioned cons, right?
So the short answer is cons, but I want to broaden the scope of the question just a little bit to include another point that is very important to me, that I harp on a lot, which is this like this fantasy line, this appropriately enough, between a game designer and a homebrew. What game are you playing? Oh, what's a homebrew? Oh, wow. It's 60 pages of stuff that you've made and thought about and changed and produced. In the same way that 15 years ago, the concept of a hack was a pejorative term. People would talk about, oh, this is a hack of this system, as a way of it's not real game design. But the goal of something like PPTA is that now all of a sudden people are making hacks, and they are seen as this is a real game. This is the way that the term has changed. And that's the way I still feel about homebrew. I mean, from that sense, everybody who's homebrewing, you are a game designer right now. And I think that's amazing. I want to play your game. I want to listen to you. I want to ask you questions because I love this stuff. Like, I'm a huge nerd, and I'm here because I'm deeply passionate about this stuff. And so you have a home campaign. I want to hear about it. Oh, what are you doing? Oh, what elements are you forgetting? What are you deconstructing? That's the shit. That's game design. And so I was doing that. I was a kid, and you waiting for the band concert to start, and I'm like going to the brass section and being like, who wants to do some shit? And I'm immediately messing with the rules and changing things and asking questions, which I think is the critical part about why you game designer. When you start asking questions about the system, nobody's asking you to, but you sit down at the end and like, that was weird. Why did it work that way? Why did the session go that way? Why am I asked to use this rule in this way? And so I was immediately doing that, and then without realizing, was finding other systems. So it wasn't just necessarily boredom, it was curiosity. I wasn't mad at D&D, but I was asking questions about what second and mostly third edition were doing. And so then I was playing Call of Cthulhu, Vampire the Masquerade, and being an evangelist and being curious, exploring. I lived in New Mexico for a long time, so I was there weren't any cons that were like felt close, but eventually I made it to Gen Con. And Gen Con, the very first day was amazing and wonderful because I was working in a board game cafe, and so all of a sudden it felt like Mecca in terms of games and game designers and new games and board games and card games and role-playing games. And it was amazing. The second day, I found Indie Press Revolution, IPR, and said, oh my God, more than me cares about these games. And all the ones, it was like this portion that I owned and 80% that I didn't, my very first Gen Con, and was just over the moon. And on the last day, I found Games on Demand, Indie Games on Demand. So it was just that Sunday, and realized, oh, cons aren't conspicuous consumption. It's not just, capitalism and Funko Pops and t-shirts, which is like, I didn't care. I never wanted to go for most of my life. But I realized that most cons, particularly ones of a certain size, are a series of interconnected microcultures. And so I met people, and I saw Jason Morningstar in the corner, like sitting there running some weird LARP that he had just written, and was like, oh my God, that's Jason Morningstar. And I go up to him and I say, hi, Jason, I'm Graham. And I just want to thank you. The experiences I've had playing your games, I couldn't replace them for anything. And he's like, I that's the best thing I've ever heard. He starts to cry, and we talked for like 10 minutes about some other game I played and some other game he played. And he's like, that's a cool idea. That's a cool idea. And we shook hands and left. And some people were like me. They were like new to the idea. And then some people are like pointing at those things. And so it's just building community one by one by one. So finding other places to go. Oh, where else are we going to play these games? Oh, what's this thing called Metatopia? And then meeting more people who are doing the thing and realizing that in one way or another, this is a very special place, and then you can find those parts. So that's largely how it ended up. And then working at cons, I support my friends' games while making my own, and then having the space to go, and then more tools happening, backer kit and all these other things, and just seeing your friends make a thing and struggle and then succeed, and then cheering them on makes it easier for you to do it because you are emotionally invested and you care, and it matters a lot.
No, that's such a good, inspiring answer. I definitely agree that cons are a series of microcultures, and I think indie games especially are just always a series of microcultures, but they're usually so geographically diffuse, and even I think on Discord kind of diffuse, and cons kind of force those moments of serendipity. Like you're saying, you just bump into someone who you become friends with, you might even work with, whom otherwise might just seem like some inaccessible person. You would probably be unlikely to cold DM or email as much as you would approach at a con where you can see that there's that space for for just kind of chatting and being like, hey, I like this book. I think that's even I can't remember when we met, but it was kind of that same thing. It's like it
I
cons you.
think
You
we were
don't know
floating
who's
around
who.
MythWorks, and you
Yeah,
came over and
MythWorks, but
we talked about MythWorks stuff, and then we talked about game design. You said you had a
yeah,
company, and I'm
yeah,
always interested in what people are doing. If they say I'm a game designer, as somebody who is quite comfortable talking to strangers, I honestly do care. So when I say tell me more, I'm not saying a thing. I do want to know, because the idea of finding out something new is incredible and wonderful, and I know how difficult it is to talk about my own ideas and be proud of them. So by helping others, it's a way of like leveling the playing field and making
yeah,
more
yeah.
games happen.
Yeah, and I was just gonna. I think the way we met is I said, "Oh, Under the Autumn Strangely, I like that," and you were like, "I like that too," because you created it, right? So that was a serendipitous. Like I didn't know who you were. I like that
Right.
game.
I was just some schmuck. Yeah.
No. But I mean, we could have talked anyway. It just happened to be you're standing right there next to your own game. So it's
Yeah.
similar to what you're saying with Jason. Of just like that's a cool moment. Of like, oh man, that's awesome. Like now I get to like talk with Graham Gentz who wrote this game. That's really
Yeah.
good.
Yeah.
So about that, maybe that's one game that people might have heard of, and I don't know, just because I like it. Could you say a little about Under the Autumn Strangely? And if there's any other games, I mean, if you want to sort of highlight a couple of your works that you made
Yeah.
in between
Yeah.
starting and like now, this
So
year.
there's a
Yeah.
couple big pieces of Out of the Atom Strangely and how it happened. One is Zine Quest at Kickstarter, which I think is great because it really starts to push people into a position of a reasonable project from beginning, middle, and end. Because the like last 10%, the last 1%, there is an asymptotic difficulty that occurs when you're trying to finish a project. The number of drafts that occur and the PDFs that occur, and then all of a sudden you realize that for the last 7 drafts you've had this one typo that somehow you've missed, and then all the like fear and insecurity and imposter syndrome magnify like in that point, like nobody cares about this sucks. And having ZineQuest be this annual or sometimes twice annual, what are you doing guys, thing where people say, if you staple a bunch of papers together and sell it out of the back of your car, you've done it. You've made a zine. Which is also the other thing I like about indie games, is has this like punk rock, go buy somebody's CD out of their car feel, which like the $5 I'm buying for this thing is, in terms of just this unitarian value of money, is so much more valuable to somebody who's given me their art than for me, that it just represents this abstract thing. I love buying zines for $5 or $10 for indie games, even if I'm only mildly interested in what they're doing. If it's like, if I like the premise alone, I will absolutely almost always get a $5 or a $10 zine. If it's queer, if it's political, if it has something that it's trying to say, like I absolutely boom, boom, boom. I'm very, very open with these things. And so that's one of them. The other one is the fact that over and over and over again, people started saying that they were watching Over the Garden Wall every year. And it's had this growing cultural effect. And for me, that was the interesting part. Like I saw the show and enjoyed it. But over and over again, people would say, this is my favorite thing. I watch it every single year. And I'm like, yeah, it's pretty creepy. And they look at me and be like, Greg is so cute. And I'm like, oh, that's
Sure.
true.
Yeah.
But I never would have thought of that from, again, me and looking at a piece of art,
Yeah.
and art is reflecting. Like when I say, why do I like Over the Garden Wall? It's so Pottsfield is the coolest thing I've ever seen. It's like the perfect storytelling in 10 minutes, but then other people are doing that too. And so as I'm thinking, okay, this is interesting. Why is his art doing this in this way? I'm a big horror guy. So if I was to write Graham Gentz's Over the Garden Wall game, it would be a horror game. And I do call it a horror game, but there's no horror mechanics. Again, it's me playing on the expectations of players. I think there's a lot to be said about written rules and then unwritten rules and expectations in terms of a game. Something like D&D is essentially a folk game because of the things that have been learned and relearned and unlearned. But I am very lucky in an indie space to have these things and see how many of the stuff that I can uproot in terms of expectation. And then it's stone soup. And then all of a sudden people are making this thing that I don't have any part in. So that's where I was going with the mechanics and ideas. So it's GM list. There's 3 roles. And what I'm doing is I'm breaking apart like the roles of what it means to be in a role-playing game. You have a traveler who's lost in the world. You have the Arcadian, which is the world itself and the like weirdos that live there. But there is something wrong. You have somebody who's like complicating and adding and twisting the knife and having that like ... and doesn't quite sit right with you. Like I described this person, you know, being kind of strange. They look at you, and then the terror gets to go, and it fills you with dread. But these are two different people. So what you're talking about with your game with the two GMs, you don't know who to look at. I am banking on a very similar thing. It plays 3 to 6. So you have two terrors. They specifically have themes that they have to come up with that flavor their descriptions of what's going wrong, but they're secret. Everything else is open information, but that specifically is secret. So you have this diegetic moment of the two people whispering and conspiring together. And I haven't said in the book to do this. I haven't said that this is part of it, but it is for me part of the experience, and people are experiencing it by playing the game. So that's the unwritten rules part. And then it's a bunch of dream logic. I ask people to ask these questions they don't know answers to. And so as a result, the game ends up very, very rabbit hole travel because people have no prep. They haven't made the thing, and they're answering questions that they find. And then I'm asking them to freeform associate with like autumnal imagery and pastorally surreal ideas like giant vegetables or human hearts growing from a tree. And then when they answer those questions, they're discovering the themes. This prep is death. Don't prep. That's how we roll. Never prep anything ever. That's why we roll.
I mean, I don't know. Sometimes prep's okay.
No prep. Try it. Try not prepping.
We have. We've done no prep. We've done.
I do both.
Light prep, which I think is good, depending on the games you're running. And then definitely I agree that heavy prep is what most first time GMs in my experience, like where they get hung up.
Yeah, for sure.
It's the I have to have the steepled finger and I have to present an idea, but for me it's about keystone skills and listening and leveraging the idea that we've all read books and seen movies and have friends and talk about things, and things evolve over time. That's what a role-playing game is, and having the skills to like listen actively to what people are doing. That's why I love this prep is death shit, because I think it makes the table healthier and more reactive and more interesting. It doesn't mean it's haphazard. It means that I don't come in with expectations, and therefore you're more interested. I think it makes the games healthier. It's easier to use safety tools. It's you are more focused and on the same page with the players about the thing that's happening at the table regardless.
Yeah, I think it's a question we can come back to. Here Vex is saying something I think was also something Michael Sands said, is you have to be careful about what you mechanize, because the space people are playing in cannot be the mechanics. And I think that most applies to horror, and Vex's thought. So I think that is interesting to come back to, sort of the way that Under the Unstrange, I think, really neatly has these kind of horrific moments, but leaves a lot open. And yeah, to your point about player safety, I mean, definitely, I think, I don't know, it doesn't feel unsafe in the way that I think other horror games maybe they're playing on different trips. Maybe just it's the sort of over the garden wall vibe too is not the same as like a slasher movie, for sure. The pastoral horror, as you call it, but yeah, I mean, coming back to the no prep thing too, I think that is it's also framing, right? So maybe prep is one, maybe that term can mean different things to different people, but some of it is like just setting up expectations and framing like the kinds of stories, the kinds of interactions. And I think a lot of what it sounds like you're doing as a game designer is trying to build that in. So that is the system, and that is framing a certain kind of, in the case of that game, a certain kind of horrific vibe without necessarily bringing in other kinds of horrific vibes. But like you said, it's kind of up to the player, and, it would be up to sort of listening to each other, and that's going to make the game stronger. So, I mean, I agree that it's ultimately ideal play experiences. Everyone's kind of listening and improvising together. And creating space for those moments where no one person could have come up with the cool idea that emergently everyone comes up with. Like you said, the example of Ska, Mothra, and Transformers, right? Like,
yeah. So I had a lot of really wonderful conversations with very, very smart, interesting people over the weekend, like Ryan Kahn, go by Bug Dish. It's a game where you can play bug chefs, and Sydney Icarus, who made Decay in Orbit. which is all about being an AI that's like slowly falling into a star. And Sydney and Ryan and I talked about not just safety tools, a separate idea of supportive design. Games that are written with a very particular kind of thing in mind, and it's not explicitly stated, but it might be explicitly designed. And so a big part of my ethos of this prep stuff and how I present ideas, and I'm very passionate about horror and horror storytelling. And I think one of the only times Ryan took, he's used to live in Toronto. He took an early draft of Under the Autumn Strangely to a RPG meetup and taught it to people. And one of the pieces of feedback they came from was, we have so much agency. How can this be scary? Which I think is fascinating, because again, this goes back to our question about where does the horror live and how the mechanics using it. I've played a lot of Call of Cthulhu, and I think as a high schooler playing it, I was fascinated by things like your hit points don't go up, but the other mechanical parts like the depercentile and watching your imaginary number of insanity go down and not really mean much, was the horror trying to live there. So I think our question is very apt and a very, very smart observation.
Yeah, and I think kind of that play experience too of what kind of thing are you, like even in straight up slasher games, like when we've talked with Adam Voss and Logan Dean about like 1978 and other games where someone is being the bad guy. It's like by making it a card game, a card like drafting game that then is about not killing the character who is being played by the other human you're playing with, but killing their friends. It still puts you in a weird position, and it feels very, very horrific. But it's less kind of like it's not a co-op, obviously, but it's less like two people fighting in a board game sense, and it's more of two people perpendicularly telling a story of a scary night. A classic slasher scary night, right? And so I always think of that. I mean, I was thinking of it with Under the Autumn Strangely, in that it's about people doing things that are perpendicular as opposed to directly head-to-head opposed. Right. And that framing, again, I think puts people in a certain mind space where, to your point about the steeple-fingered GM screen, GM player dynamic, that is oppositional, right? It's hierarchical, it's oppositional.
Correct.
And I think there's many ways to break that down. And obviously, it sounds like all of your games really are kind of doing that. Is that fair to say? Like you're kind of thinking through,
even my one pagers of I'm trying to say something very particular, usually about design, the culture of design, or the way that games are played specifically, the way that I have strong opinions about D&D, but on the other side, what I love is that the concept of gay D&D exists, where people throw out the rules and they're all tiefling bards, just sort of messing around in a place. That's great. I don't want my criticisms to take away from that, because they're playing a different game by the nature of you go on the playground and you adjust rules and you're listening and talking, but the steepled fingered GM is unique to that, but it is not unique to these other forms of folk games. So calling D&D a folk game, I think, really starts to frame it in a better light. This person coming up and saying, can you sell me a copy of Critical Role, again, is recontextualizing what these things mean to people and why.
No, totally. Chris, did you have a question? It looked like you were thinking of something.
Oh, well, I was going to ask, I mean, kind of piggybacking off of Wythe a little bit. You're very intentionally designing these games from the outset. No GM, no kind of hierarchies. But I'm curious, because you seem to have slightly different systems in each game. What does the kind of process look like for you? Like, I know you have a couple of games that started with names, which I think is a great place to start with a pun, personally. But yeah,
how they got Eat the Reich.
Yeah, exactly.
100% backers from that.
Yeah, exactly.
There's no way.
But yeah, what does your process look like when you're sitting down? Maybe like something that you're working on right now. Do you look at the framing of the genre? Are you looking for specific play experiences, and how do you kind of go about corralling those conversations or curating those conversations?
Yeah, those are great questions as thinking about design and how you go through and what you want the intention to be. It's never a linear process, and things that come out of creative writing, like, kill your darlings, is very, very important. Role-playing games as an experience feel like they're an extension of person, and so when you're having this other thing, it can be very, very difficult emotionally. I find personally that a big barrier I have is I will work on a thing and think I'm in the pocket and I'm about to finish it, and I fall into two big categories. One is, oh no, I've redesigned Fiasco, or oh no, I've redesigned Fate. Because they both have the ideas that influence me, and it's there. And so Terry Pratchett has this really awesome quote about Tolkien in high fantasy is very much like Mount Fuji in classic Japanese art. It's either all the way in the foreground or all the way in the back, or if it's gone, it's by specific omission. And so when I'm making a game, when I'm lucky, it's because I've struck upon an interesting thing that made me mad or inspired me, or something clicked about it not working. And a lot of the times it's me pushing pieces together until I look back and I say, oh, this isn't going to be interesting at all, or it feels identical. And sometimes I'm wrong. I play it with my friends and they say, Graham, this thing over here is really interesting you're doing. And I'm like, but that's the stupid part. And they're like, no, you're wrong. When you're doing it, your nose is pressed against the glass. And so that's another reason why I value community and cultural equity and collaboration at the table, and also with people, because then I can be that person for somebody else who's like, this thing sucks. And I'll be like, no, you're brilliant. Like, shut the hell up. You're doing great. Like, this thing is very good, and mean it, like, it's not just blowing smoke for each other. You surround yourself with people whose work you like, and then you get to have both interesting play experiences and then conversations you want to have. And then it's inspiring to you, like being able to have friends who inspire you and make things, it's I imagine I'm slightly more competitive than the people around, but in the way that I'm like, wow, this is a wonderful thing. What else can be done? What else can be made? And so going to something like Metatopia means that you're having conversations with people, which are eye-opening. And some of the games are either done in a way that frustrates you, and then you can go and use it, or you're like, this is absolutely rock and roll. I never would have thought of that. And that in and of itself is a wonderful experience. Does that answer your question at all, Chris?
Yeah, it kind of gets close to it. But I actually really like, I like this idea of negation in game design, and I don't mean that in a strictly
like a negative space kind of idea.
Well, I mean, in the sense of like finding something that you don't like and then building backwards from that, or building off of it. Like, I find myself in that space a lot, where I find certain genres or certain genre conceits to be really frustrating with fantasy, and that's how I started writing Danse Macabre. But it's something that nobody's really brought up before, where it's like, yeah, sometimes you just don't like how a thing is designed, and you want to morph it or mold it to something that you think is better, which is completely valid.
Yeah. My background is screenwriting. I had like an anthropology minor in humanities, but I studied screenwriting ultimately, and so and taught it for a little while afterwards. But my professor, one of his things he would say a lot was, when speaking to a class and they're like trying to get ideas, trying to find inspiration, he would go up and say, "You got to find something that really pisses you off." And I thought that was very funny. So sometimes when I'm feeling blank, I'll sit down and be like, what's kicking around my head that I haven't externalized? And I've had some pretty interesting things come out of that. Not all the time. Sometimes, again, it's just getting over that hump, that 20-minute mark, and that when you're still writing is really, really important, because you've managed to like filter through a lot of the barriers that you yourself have put up for you. So whatever you can find, whatever is the middle, beginning, and end of this process is very powerful.
Yeah, and I mean, we have talked a little about the negative design space in terms of system, Chris, I think, on this show about our own games, but I think it's a good point that we haven't talked a lot about it in terms of thematization and thematic integration, and I think it's interesting to think about that personally, just because like a lot of what Stillfleet started with was making a list when I finally was like, okay, I'm going to do my own thing, not just as maybe a homebrew, but what isn't going to go in the game, and thinking about sci-fi tropes, not even things I didn't like. So there is that what pisses me off moment, but there's also stuff where it's like, for example, I love cats. My wife and I have multiple cats and love cats, but I decided
favorite musical, huh?
They all just went extinct.
You love
No
T.S.
cats.
Eliot.
No, there's none. There's none in the game. They don't exist. No versions of cats exist in any of the game. And why is that? Well, it's partly because it's like, all right, it's like the more things you can cross off the list, the more it highlights the things you leave in. And the more that it begins to feel alien because you've underlined certain things and deleted others. And those somewhat arbitrary choices really add up. to the point where people say, oh man, this feels so distinct, or like I feel like I know how it would work, because even though they don't know the rules, they kind of know that there are rules, and they know that the universe has some sort of shape. And I think that goes back to your thing about like Ska, Mothra, Transformers. Like, pick any three things as yeses, pick any three things as nos. You could start a million stories, a million games with just like those two lists, right?
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't possibly agree with what you're saying more. It's one of my other writing. I was a theater critic for about 6 years, and I never thought I was going to be a journalist, but they paid me to write, and I was like, great, this is what I want to do. And I'm a theater person, so I was going and writing about things that I thought. And that's another thing about how did you become a game designer? I realized that my education is in writing, which is reading things, thinking about them, and then giving people things that they can process in a way that's, also remembering there's a human behind making this art. And then when you're talking about theater, I mean, that's incredibly vulnerable about this person doing thing. And so when I was writing about things that oftentimes were not professional theater, some of the time, it would change very much how I would write and how you communicate these ideas. And so that's another reason why I love to play test, is because it's the thing I've been doing my whole life and love doing and can't stop thinking about. Every movie, it has what I call the role-playing disease, where you're like, oh, well, no, that's what the GM rolls his thing. And, they made a character choice, right? Everyone was like, Guardians of the Galaxy is a D&D adventure. I'm like, everything's a D&D adventure. Are you kidding me?
It always has been. It's that.
It always has been.
Yeah, it's the meme of like two astronauts. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Watergate was the funniest high-level campaign where everyone rolled ones the whole time.
Now we're talking. It's a disease, and I can't get out of my head.
I thought you meant that you just want to turn everything that you see into, because that's my disease. It's
a compulsion. It's a compulsion where, as I'm thinking about plot and development, like I'm thinking about 2 or 3 different things, which is the part of it is the screenwriting professor in me, which is like, what is the interesting choice to make here? What is the boring choice to make here? I am almost finished with The Penguin, and I'm blown away by the show because over and over and over again, they make interesting choices, which for me is so frustrating. What I call like a weak writing is not about dialogue or character, because there's no such thing as a bad idea, but when is the choice in the screenplay or the role-playing game being made that is not compelling, that doesn't create more story, that isn't a therefore or a but, it's just and. It doesn't de-escalate. It doesn't, if you present an idea, what is the next most interesting thing to happen? That is a big part of where it is. And with Wythe talking about eliminating pieces and negative space, I feel like I'm saying that a lot as a playtester, is you have all these ideas, and the more you have, you're actually hiding the good thing, which I think is here, and here. These are great ideas. So minimize, deconstruct, cut it down. Like, this play should be 20 minutes shorter. This movie should be 30 minutes shorter. It feels like I'm a broken record, but it's such a breath of fresh air. And when somebody steps back and says, oh, this is the thing, it's not just like sleeker, it's objectively better. And I think this is a really important distinction.
And I agree, even though, and I'm a maximalist and I write long. I mean, I'm more coming, I mean, I was actually also trained as a screenwriter and then anthropologist, but I mostly write prose.
Hey, all right, let's go.
As a living, I write fiction in the ad world, and then I write fiction after, in the form of sci-fi games. But I completely agree with what you're saying, because even for maximalism, like if you think about something like Merkborg, which I didn't work on, but know pretty well, whatever I think about it, right? It's extremely maximal, but it in some ways it's still very short, and so they're getting that sort of feeling, that energy out of specific choices and the way that they're iterating them, as opposed to every single metal Viking satanic thing they could have. They didn't do that, right? They have just the basilisk. There's only a couple monsters, and so they sort of are choosing a couple themes and then playing those keys. And I think, similarly, that's what I've tried to do with my like sci-fi, is like even something that it was much longer, like compressing, cutting it down, and ending up with the best, juiciest stuff. And I think that can work with really any genre, any format, any kind of game. You've said a lot of smart things about game design, but like kind of regardless of someone's game design, I think they could take and just sort of like, find like, what are the things afterward that I want to most highlight? It doesn't mean you couldn't do other things, but like, what are the key, like, can you bullet point the themes? I don't know.
Yeah. So I just play tested, or played for the first time, because it was more like me floating around ideas, and then all of a sudden I lost a week of time in the middle of nowhere. How did that happen? Who knows? So I showed up to these playtests with I really took my my prep is death idea to the next logical extreme, which is how much of this do you actually know what you want to test and control? And you always have to have specific things in mind. And so Borg, I was thinking about, okay, what is this game actually about, and what do I want it to be about, and therefore, what are the mechanics trying to do? And I own Borg. I've played it a handful of times, bounced off it a little bit. But if you have it in your hands, you get it immediately because it's an art book. First and foremost, is communicating an idea, and they have a free version, a minimal, it's text only. And I picked up my copy because I was like, okay, like what is this thing that I'm commenting on actually? And flipping through it was like, I can't use this. And I put it down, found the free version, read through it in about 3 minutes, and then said, I got it. And then I had the game. And it is the basilisk, and it is all these themes, it is this stuff, but maximalist in the way that like everything approaches a single tone, but then the dice is all like OSR. It's all like we're going to have 3 stats, and the things are actually very simple, and the items are item descriptions about how like it's killing you and it drips blood, and we're going to do that on a D66 table. Wah! But the game itself is very much in this like how the OSR and NSR is the same as a storytelling game. Like they're like kissing cousins because you're taking minimalism to its logical conclusion in both sides. But one of them has something interesting to say, and one says this was better before we had mechanics trying to suggest something about story. But that's
Yeah,
that's
no,
very
I agree.
tangenty.
Yeah.
That's very tangenty.
No, I agree with that last point. And when I said maximalist, I mean in the sense of the vibe, even though the object itself, to your point, the rules are nothing, and the book itself is actually not very long. I mean that as a addendum to your point about like compression and choosing a theme, whatever it is, whether or not I particularly like that game or not, it's just a common example, I think, of something that it feels like it has like a specific tone. And I think we could probably point at like a bunch of other examples. I don't mean to sort of particularly vaunt that one.
No. There's an Edgar Allan Poe quote about like a story needs every single word needs to point to a single tone, and I don't believe that necessarily. However, God damn it, could Poe do that? Like he set his mind to it, and he knew how to do the thing, and he executed the thing. For me, I like tonal clash. That's why all my games are like very serious and very stupid, because you find this incredibly powerful human release in both. Horror and comedy function in the same release and setup, which is why horror comedies are like peanut butter and chocolate. They function the same way narratively. And so in terms of maximalism, the idea would be like, how many systems are you having there, and how many different choices are you making, is what I'm thinking about. The minimalism of the game is we're going to offer a whisper of rules and then say, how are you going to use your, I would argue, background cultural knowledge? What do you filter through the idea of, oh, it's death metal? Okay, well, who here hasn't seen a death metal album cover or seen the music or whatever? And half the people raised their hands.
Yeah,
and then one person is really into it,
Yeah, that was something that Hex of Vexagon said in our chat, which is Morkborg doesn't need lore because everyone who plays it has 20 albums of lore from symphonic metal, which is, it's true. I mean,
half the PCs do, or maybe even less, or the one guy really, really does.
Right.
And some people are like, I guess I listen to Tenacious D, and then there's one person is like, I'm a ska head, but I'm just happy to be here. And there are tables
one guy at the
one
table
game,
that's a new metal guy.
It's a new metal guy, right? It's a possible convert. You just got to get the Morkborg in him, baby. But that's what I'm saying. Like, so much about game design is about this assumption of shared cultural knowledge, but sometimes it's not, because I don't know. I've only played Morkborg like 3 times, and I would say every single time was not with all metalheads, and I'm not a metalhead. Like I'd say I like Mastodon, and that's about it. I get more proggy. I like.
Yeah, same. I'm with you. I mean, that's actually similar to what I was going to say, which is I actually don't think it's about the cultural touchstones. And my cultural touchstones are like from other cultures 300 years ago, largely. So like a lot of this stuff, I'm like, yeah, no idea. Like I love Mastodon actually, so it's funny you mentioned that. But I mean, they're just so good. But yeah, I think like Vex is saying something about narrative structure that I completely agree with, which is like maybe it's more about David Lynchian stories, which Vex points out, cut through details and focus on certain vibes. So I can think of a bunch of different sort of narrative structure vibe styles that aren't really, they may be for me cultural touchstones, like the works of James Tiptree Jr. Alice Sheldon, like her stories are just imprinted on my mind, and they have very specific sort of forms and characters. Most people probably haven't read them, sadly, even if she's an amazing sci-fi writer, but like it sort of doesn't matter. What matters is people have seen certain kinds of far future dystopian sci-fi that examine, has Cronenbergian like body horror and plays with ideas of species and gender and all these things. So I think like, those vibes can be picked up on kind of regardless of the cultural touchstone. And I think you're coming back to your work. I mean, I think Under the Autumn strangely gets there, even if people have not seen Over the Garden Wall, they get the vibe, right, that you want. And it sounds like the new one with the kids becoming bikes becoming kids. It seems like you're doing a lot there that, as you're saying, it really doesn't. You could plug in almost any random cultural artifact, and then the game is actually this engine for like milling that into a sort of shared story that has certain. Ultimately, everything does come down to certain constraints, right? It has certain narrative constraints or something. So there's going to be a transformation. It's a story about becoming. It doesn't have to be a Bildungsroman. Maybe it's about an old couple dying because they kind of turn into bikes together, and it's like a sad, sweet, like. Nice kind of rom-com type thing. So I can imagine like a lot going on there, and I like how you're using genre as like raw material.
Yeah, plus 30 points for Bildungsroman. The idea is that I am leveraging what people want to do and when they don't want to do it. I love David Lynch and I really like surrealism, partially because both my training and interest and one of the many lenses that I use is so structuralist by nature. And so when somebody is thinking, it's the same thing about playing a game, play test or something with somebody's presenting ideas that I've never even thought of. This is like seeing a great piece of art, particularly when it breaks free of certain assumptions. And so I've played a handful of games that want to be Lynchian, that are trying to be surreal, but the nature of role-playing games are already structured. So how are you going to deconstruct that? And I've found that most things don't do it enough. And again, I'm not the only person who has this, oh no, I've redesigned Fiasco problem. I'd say roughly half the games that I've played that have said we're a Lynchian thing, it's just Fiasco. But then like, what is the engine doing to make it Lynchian? Well, it's not. And so what I leverage in Under the Autumn Strangely is the question, which is like casting a line out and not knowing where it is, and then you are the person who's pulling it in, and you're walking as you pull it in, so you don't know where it is, while other people have agency, so nobody knows the answers, and things are going through, and as you just pulled over 2 or 3 great names of really fabulous things that may be at the surface or underneath. You're aware, you're unaware, but if I say don't prep, we got there again, and you say, well, what am I supposed to do? But you are supported by other players doing the same thing. All of a sudden, the stone soup is happening. And over and over again, surrealist stories come out because people are trying desperately to find this thing. And it becomes like dream logic. Dream logic in the way that like your brain comes up with an image. And then immediately your brain clicks in and says, oh, that's actually normal because, and then it backward pedals, try to explain it. Like every time. I'm very, very bad at lucid dreaming. My brain is very good at explaining any stupid shit that's happening in a dream, being like, it's very normal that Aubrey Plaza is here and has 3 arms because don't you remember? And I'm like, yeah, I do. Of course I do. Like, why wouldn't it be that way? And so as a result, I have found the people who come in with, oh my God, this is going to be Over the Garden Wall, tend to have less of a good time because they're pushing their intention really hard into the middle. And so my idea is that it's a tonal sort of Ouija board. And so some games are more horrific and some ones are more whimsical. But that is the joy. Again, I want the people to find the tone as they go. It's not the game where like the steepled finger GM has a gritty game, but the players want to sell lemonade at a lemonade stand. And it's the meme of, oh, stupid PCs. Oh, no, woebegone, forever GM, another phrase I hate. If the GM just listened to the players and leaned into the lemonade stand, they would have the best game ever because that's where the game resides. So that's what Under the Autumn Strangely is it's trying to say, what's your lemonade stand? And then helping you get there.
Yeah, I also think it also is a question of genre and collective, like some of the framing that we talked about earlier. Like if you're all down with that, so it's a game where suddenly Aubrey Plaza walks in and she has 3 arms, then everyone's cool with it. Some people may go, and we meet these people at cons, I'm sure you do as well, who want to do I'm in a dungeon fighting goblins, and you can push back against that, but there's some 80-20 rule of, give them what they want to some degree and have fun with it. And what are you pushing back on and why? So I think if every game is purely surreal, if that's your thing, that's great. But I think some designers are looking for like a specific genre or narrative structure or vibe. And then it's kind of designing to that. And I think that, whether you're using these terms, whether it's tone setting, as I think what Vex is saying, or like framing is often how I think of it in terms of narrative, like in dramaturgy or something, you're trying to get people to kind of view themselves as doing a certain type of thing, and then not over preparing or telling them what to do, but getting into the mindset of sort of how to do it. I agree that can be really powerful because they have so much agency in it, and the stories are so much better when there's not a forever GM steeple-fingered telling a story, but everyone is creating a story together. I think that feels like, Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's something I feel like on the show we come back to a lot, is like RPGs are ultimately collective stories, however they're constrained in terms of, dice, no dice, whatever. And you do want everyone involved. You just can't really do it if it's I feel like this is the worst version, right? We've all either played this when we were 12 or seen it on cons or listened to a whack podcast, but the GM is telling the story and everyone is just sitting there waiting.
Yeah.
And there's an awkwardness to that. And I will say, just because we just got back from cons, that still is, I think, how a lot of, especially just people new to the hobby, that's their assumption. They kind of wait and they need to be authorized to make shit up. They need to be authorized to jump in and be like, no, I know, I have the idea. And so it's a lot of these tools, whatever tricks we come up with, they're all tricks to get people to just kind of relax and have fun and like go nuts. That's kind of one way to think about it.
You're describing supportive design. This is such a big soapbox for me. I've said things to groups like, don't be afraid of silence. In the example of play at the beginning of my book, when the play begins, the very first is a parenthetical that says there's a long, awkward silence where no one is sure who should speak first. It's part of it, and I think that's okay. What's the phrase? It's not a bug. It's a feature, not a bug.
Feature, not a flaw.
Yeah. Is this stuff you've talked about, Chris, on the previous episodes? I mean, I've already listened to every one, but it's hypothetical, right? I'm just teeing you up.
A hypothetical feature, not a flaw. Yeah, thanks, man. I actually my brain just flew out the window when you said that. I was like, wait, what?
So Wythe, talking about the people that just want to kill stuff and kill goblins and whatever, I don't see that as a problem because a number of games that exists are vast, and we're not kids. We're adults with too much responsibility and not enough time anyways. And part of the reason, again, going back to why I write the games I write, is because part of me is trying to communicate to a certain kind of person who wants to play a certain kind of game. And if they show up with an expectation, it's okay for them to leave. And oftentimes I don't get folks like that because they're playing DCC to their heart's content, which is good. That is a good thing. If somebody reads my description and goes no, then that is good. That, again, is the game doing its proper thing. Mm-hmm. And the people that show up in my game, I'm like, yes, these like people that don't go to cons, with all these other alternatives, who, again, have looked at a piece of art like Over the Garden Wall and said, this speaks to me for some reason. That's what I'm looking for. This is the kind of group that I'm interested in cultivating. I was with a friend at last Metatopia. We were having dinner with some people, and she was telling a story about a playtest that she described as terrible. And the story she told was a playtester said to her game, which I think is brilliant, which is all about coal miners, and it's called The Price of Coal. Great game. Go look it up, Jed Adcock. The playtester said, I can't imagine why anyone would ever want to play this. And everybody at the table laughed except for me. And I said, Jen, that actually is great feedback, because that person has told you so much information about who's going to play your game and who's not going to play your game. Like, these seems like a very simple thing to remember. Not everyone wants to play your game, and that's okay. It's not a value judgment on that person or on your game. Everything is subjective, and if they want to kill goblins, I want them to kill goblins because a part of me wants to kill goblins. But sometimes I want to sit down and talk about The Price of Coal because you've done something very, very interesting and very cool, and it inspires me to make more stuff.
And the same people we can go between. We can contain multitudes. We can like multiple things. I completely agree, and I don't think it's not to pick on them, and that's somewhat of a straw man argument. But I mean, like I say, you definitely see it at cons where people walk up and they'll kind of be gauging the way you write the descriptions. I think I'll speak from our own experience, like,
Yeah.
especially Aaron H and I on our team have gone to cons now for 2 years, basically selling Stillfleet and now Blister Critters and now Robot Hospital, where
Awesome.
we're running different games that we have to describe, and we have to see who shows up based on what we describe, and then what kind of play experience. Because at the end, we're very like improvisational and collaborative, and a little goofy and very surreal, and also a little horrific, and sometimes there's feeling that out as well. And you do
Talk
get
my
to
language.
You
Sounds
get
great.
to see kind of people
I'd come to that
bumping up
game.
against that. Yeah, so it's fun. It's kind of fun to have some of and you do see ecotones. You see processes of conversion, or like you were describing, people containing multitudes. So somebody will sit down where they're like, I want to play a grimdark, hard sci-fi game where we shoot aliens, but then 3 hours later they've signed up for all of the other sessions, and they're like, no, I just want to like talk to that weird robot more, and it's they could probably have also had an equally good time going over to the cyborg table and shooting aliens, but it's like they decided to sort of make that jump, and we welcome them. So I completely agree with what you're saying. It's kind of like a process of figuring out how to not even just sell yourself in the marketing sense, but clearly communicate your game design sort of philosophy and just what your games are like. And I think cons are really good practice, to come back to that theme, for like anyone who does games, who's interested in kind of finding their people, and maybe even interested in like publishing and the business side of it, because it sort of forces you to like explain what the hell you're up to.
Yeah.
So I think that's actually, and it's in a safe way. Like, people are generally very nice, that feedback.
I think almost always, and if they're not, again, it's very flash in the pan, or it's incidental, because again, there's so much space and time. It's really not a thing that somebody's going to come focus on your thing specifically, because they are going to forget about it and move on, and whatever. And if they decide it's not for them, like, the most you'll get is like a snide remark, because like we only have finite time in this earth, and people know that instinctually otherwise. So we're all nervous nerds, right? At some level, there's the awkwardness and the what if, and but it's also 70,000 awkward nerds, and like, what's that like? I mean, very smelly. But other than that, like, there's a lot of stuff that's going that, like, you have a lot of shared experience. It's very easy to talk to. I don't play 40K, but if I see somebody doing 40K, I know there's a certain number of sci-fi, grimdark, space elements that I can immediately talk to, recognize, and communicate with. Whereas, my current boss asking me if people who design games are competitive with each other in the industry. And me saying, no, we're nerds who love to play games, and we want to see more games, which seems very normal.
Totally. Yeah. Well, so before, I want to switch topics a little bit, but Chris, did you have follow-ups here on this before we do that?
No.
Okay. So I want to talk politics because we're recording Monday, November 11th. So we've just had a bit of an election here. And I know, Graham, it sounds like you're on the same wavelength as we are, with being maybe a little further left than a lot of the electorate, but probably, like a lot of the electorate, just generally sort of disappointed in the options, and also definitely disappointed in sort of how it all played out. Right, some of the actual realities are going to be pretty rough. We fear. But yeah, I'm curious. That's all just to sort of to acknowledge reality, right? We don't have to dwell on specifics on this show, since it's a show about games, but. We can, and also I just love to hear your thoughts in general on sort of politics and games. And I feel like you mentioned a few things before we got going, in passing. So just basically open-ended question. How do you think about the some of deeper themes, not just like vibes or genres of culture or something like that, but do you think about those things? Do you design sort of politics in your games, or other sort of maybe you don't think of it as politics, but like, do you have like a sort of philosophy of game design there? And I don't know, Chris, if you have anything to add to that, just given, again, like when we're recording, and, it's a good opportunity to talk to somebody else smart about this stuff. So.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing that I have playing in my brain is a tweet that I saw earlier today, which was
good. Yes. What do you got? Let's see.
Oh, all the Dims and the libs are all crying and whining, but not like me, a completely rational person who's pacing back and forth, muttering, well, it's time to rebuild the labor movement, to myself over and over again. Which, like, that's... I was like, oh, I've been encapsulated in a tweet. Great. Yeah.
Yeah. It's... we're very rational. We're very rational beings. 74 million rational beings voted. They went in the booth and they made a decision based on what they thought was going to make the economy better. That's what happened a week ago. We have no one to blame for ourselves. Yeah. When I was in high school, we were all a bunch of like young like leftists, and there's the one kid who was quote unquote moderate, and his parents were Republicans, and he brought in Republican propaganda about left-wing politicians they got in the mail. And I was so fascinated that like when I turned 18, I was a registered Republican, partially so I could vote in primaries, but also because I wanted to like get weird mail. I never got weird mail. It was all like, this person is supporting civil rights, like it's San Francisco. And I'm like, human rights are good? What's happening here? And so during the pandemic, I'm moving state to state and doing other stuff. And so the I our so-called left-wing party is so centrist that it's like beyond frustrating. And so you're stuck between not just choices of things in policy, but the deluge of like who is going to be your enemy you can best defeat when they become in power, because there's not going to be a candidate who actually represents you, your community, the things that you care about, or fight for those things, because so much of that is balanced upon the status quo. And I think 9 out of 10 answers, people ask like, why is something this way? Why is it a thing? It's money. It's driven by money and the idea that there's like momentum that's kind of built in these things. Like, why aren't there more environmental things? Well, because it directly would cut the bottom line of somebody else. The problem with conspiratorial thinking is that they're just like 2 inches off the mark, where like the truth of the matter is like so simple and like straightforward because you can draw lines there. You don't need to do these loop-de-loops for conspiratorial thinking when you can draw the lines of like power and who benefits. Let's just say who benefits. It's like very easy to do. So like my thing about voting, and in terms of voting like somebody who's a radical, is the moment that you elect somebody, they become your opponent. They're the person that you're trying to bend to the will that makes more people benefit than others. And they're not going to do that, even if they're for your quote unquote party or not. So as a result, if you're trying to protect movements, you're trying to protect people, what we have is a podcast of 3 male presenting white people, which like, I think that's the natural form of a podcast. The reason of the past week is that everybody who's already vulnerable, every community that's here that's already going to be in danger, of which life-threatening problems is going to get rapidly worse. And so it's how do we move forward and make those decisions, and being prepared to fight tooth and nail, because I'm very worried about the safety of many, 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 many people.
Yeah, for sure. No, I think that's a really good point. It's we have to balance, critiques from the left, and just some of the, I think, hard realities from the left, with, acknowledging that we do have to keep fighting, because these are real battles, and both things can be true, right?
Yeah. The problem with this stuff is that it's not black and white, and there's degrees. With the left is eating the left, it's you're either selflessly sacrificing for people in need, or you're throwing the disabled into the meat grinder for benefits, right? There's really no idea of like
at the electoral level. There is no left, right? There's the right,
exactly.
Which is the Democrats, and there's
I'm not a registered Democrat, because
crazy
when I had to
Nazis, which is the Republicans.
I
right?
was like, you don't represent me at all. Like, I can vote for you in elections, but there's nothing about the Democratic Party that represents my values whatsoever, because they're center left.
No, they fused. It's a weird transformation. I definitely think that is true, that they've just fused with the neocons, so that the Cheneys being welcomed into the Democrats just makes
it's wrapped all the way around, because it's money. They've realized that they're the threat. They don't have the power to enforce their things anymore. They're being pushed out politically. Their things aren't being prioritized, incidentally. So now we have Liz Cheney on stage talking with Democrats, which whatever.
So it definitely, I think, is an opportunity, even if it's a very difficult one, right? And not fun and not hopeful. And to your point, it's scary, and it requires hard work, and we have to really think about who is vulnerable in this moment, who's the most vulnerable, But I think it is still an opportunity to say the old parties are dead, right? One of them has formed itself around a single very, very old, crazy, famous guy, and then everyone else is just glommed into this middle right, warmongering rich people party, and then that leaves the other 374 million of us to be like, what should we do? To bring it back, it doesn't, the games may play the most minor of roles in this, but I think it's more a good microcosm or example of there are weirdos out there. We do get together. We're fairly smart, fairly nice. And you know, I do try to take some hope from like, all right, there are people who are cool. Not everyone has become, you know, red pilled MAGA whatever or just given up. And I think you know, whether that feeds into our game design or not is sort of irrelevant. You know, in terms of the day to day. But I definitely I think we could at least, you know, I don't know, play around with that. I'm sure other game designers will. Probably a lot of people will run the opposite direction toward escapism, which again, perfectly fine, makes total sense.
Yeah.
Both are fine. But yeah, I don't know, Chris. I don't know. We haven't really talked about this either because we've both been out of town actually. But
yeah, we've been a lot going on. I mean, I was going to say one thing. I think this is reminding me of is just even in Under the Autumn Strangely, there is this kind of, and you were saying this earlier, Graham, right? There's this anti-hierarchical kind of design philosophy that goes into it. And what I like about that is that it allows us to still play in some escapist spaces and make, I don't know, just making spaces where you can have those political discussions where they feel a little bit less edgy, they feel a little bit less personal, but you're still able to explore it there is really nice. And even if it's only in the structure of the game, I think that there is something to that. What that something is, I don't know.
Well, so you asked me about at what stage is my intention of being political and politicalization, and then I talked about politics. And the reason is because my broader answer is that the boring answer is that all art is political, but the more meaningful and thoughtful answer that I think is important to articulate is the idea that it can't help it, because we are complex beings that live in a political life, and if you are thoughtful, then there's many other things beyond the space of this game that is being made now that affects it and changes it. We are drawn to art that speaks to us for one reason or another. Sometimes it's conscious, sometimes it's not. And so when I am making a game, I find that it'll happen at any and every stage. So sometimes I have this very particular thing that I'm trying to address. Sometimes I'll start with the kernel, and then as I'm continuing to adjust it, I realize that there's something happening here. So it's part of that as well. Sometimes I'll get to the end and be like, okay, well, how am I going to change this? So it's incidental and intentional, and it's neither and it's both. Because it's a reflection of who I am. But, you know, I love Death of the Author because I agree in it specifically. In my example of play, and Under the Autumn Strangely, I appear and I say, it's okay, you don't have to follow these rules. And then time and space are returned to their normal state. There's sort of two last lines in the book, and one of them is, after all, American history is fundamentally a horror story. And then the one by itself is all on the one page, and it says embrace serendipity. And so a lot of what I'm doing is, again, this minimalist structure thing is how am I trying to communicate ideas with as few words as possible, and then letting go of the wheel, and then having that all people kind of rush forward. And so if everybody is driving, nobody's driving. And so there are structural things happening. And part of that is the way I care about games, the way I care about healthy, positive, good tables, but also like, what do I think make games better? But also it's what I think about people and culture and humanity, and I can't not have that be part of it as well. And so if I say this is a horror story of Americana, I've already suggested something without actually saying it, and then I shove it out there, and then people are taking their own experiences. Why do they have these ideas, and how do they bring them in? And as a result, there's a certain amount of it that's selfish, because if I keep teaching at different cons the game that I wrote, but I'm not the person doing the same adventure or even the same concept or even playing the same mechanics, over and over and over and over and over again, I can be pleased and wowed with what people are created and making over and over again. And they're all equally interesting. And then even pulling even further back thematically, it feels like they're all canonical because they're all following this same dream space and like strangeness. And so, like, you know, I've done what I really wanted to do all along, which is write the Twilight Zone. Please, please, please. All I really want to do is write the Twilight Zone. Dear God, somebody give me a anthology show like the X-Files. I do so well. But then sometimes people get to make it cute. And then I'm like, that rocks. I wouldn't have done that. And I love it.
I mean, there's also no stopping you from using a similar system in an anthology kind of set. You know, it's like you could absolutely do the
Yeah.
X-Files. You could do any of that.
No,
You
I
could
play
write
every
all of
game
it.
that claims to be the X-Files because I say I like that stuff because it's so much of me feeling my escapism as well. Like
Yeah.
escapism is a big part of it. It doesn't have to not be. It's you change as you go, different kinds of media. Like I role played and created characters very differently as a younger person, and as I grew and as I continued my education of like writing and things. There was a certain point, I don't know, like as a high schooler into college, I wanted to use hyper competence to tell an interesting story because those were the pulp books I was reading and adventure stories. And this is shit I've been arguing about all weekend, which is the idea of systems mastery being the player being able to affect the narrative in a way that they want. And I had a big we argued about that for a couple of hours. But for me, now it's not just like I won an arc or something. Like I find a lot of compelling moments when I get to play a blowhard moron, because the levels of complexity of my character increase. And even in a hierarchical setting, challenging somebody in charge of my fate to like, how much are they going to screw me over? How much are they really going to challenge me? What choices do I make if I'm not aware as a player versus a character what's happening? And so, yeah, I like playing blowhard morons a lot now. Somebody with a big mouth who fails constantly and like is difficult to see like why they're the reason of their own failure. It's a lot of fun. I highly recommend.
I mean, success is so boring. It's so vanilla, really. It's like
Boring, and also again, it's the moving goalpost. Like, what does it
right.
mean?
Yeah. It's better to have friction in our stories, I think.
Yeah, and I think a lot of what you're getting at is also that there's a kind of you that comes through regardless. And what's fun is once you feel really comfortable and you feel like you've to some degree like mastered or whatever, you're comfortable with genre and character tropes and stuff. You just do yourself, and then you modulate. You change the filter or whatever. So now I'm more on killing goblins, but it's still there's going to be a part of you that is quote unquote political, or right, that has these thoughts, and they're going to kind of come out. And I think that can actually work even better. So sort of playing against type to a degree, it's not like I would never play like a fascist character, but I think playing a dumb guy, quote unquote, right, a trope of that is fun because it allows you to come up with new ways to say things you think instead of saying it the way you normally would IRL. It's the escapism doing the work of opening a space up for yourself to kind of be a little different with people, and especially with strangers. Sometimes that's just a more relaxed way to be, as opposed to like, let's all sit around and have really deep thoughts together. Like that sounds scary,
Yeah.
whereas if you say,
it is scary.
let's all sit around and kill goblins, it's like, oh, that's not scary, that's fun, I know how to do that, and everyone lets go, but you're still bringing you to the table. And I think that that for me is some of the fun of playing these games over and over and over again. It's just being able to kind of be different people, but I'm also always myself and being aware of that. And I always go back to like, I just love David Lynch, and he just talks about that so much in his art, where he like can't help it. Like he is such a weird guy that every single thing he makes is the weirdest thing ever. But it's also very Midwestern, and it's also very Buddhist. Yeah. And those are parts of him that are equally as true as the surrealism. And I think some of the joke version, the trope version of David Lynch is that everything is just weird and dissolving, but also it's not. It's very quiet and almost sort of passive.
And funny.
And there's a way that even the scariest moments in the great, Lynch movies, there's a kind of distance and an emotional distance. And I think that comes from the fact he can't get rid of the fact that he's really into transcendental meditation. And, so I think each of us brings these sort of aspects to our art. And even if you're trying to make the most escapist RPG, this is like a thesis, I guess, you're ultimately going to bring some sort of political commitments to it, right? And people may or may not sort of pick up on that. It may or may not matter, quote unquote. But I think cons are, again, just come back to cons. They're a fun place to kind of explore, and you can kind of press the gas more or less on some of those things.
There are different environments, and they're all fair.
Yeah.
And I will happily admit before anyone else that I'm a pretentious hipster. But the idea that I like everything that we've said. Okay, I like killing goblins. I like power fantasy. I like the blowhard moron stuff. I like everything in between. All of those things are fun, and I enjoy doing them. I just tend to be at the moment being like, how is it that this idea is making this work? And why am I wanting to kill the goblin? This is very interesting. How am I feeling when I kill the goblin? And so sometimes in a con setting, like, that doesn't matter, and there's other things going on. But sometimes I'm thinking about how are people reacting, and I'm like people watching, or I'm thinking about the choices people are making and why. And that's, from force or habit, or just like what has happened since I was very young and leaving those band concert games of D&D while we're all sitting on the floor, being like, why did my dick friend act like such a dick then? That's interesting. I don't know why, right? And like screaming matches with your stupid college friends about stuff they did in Vampire the Masquerade because it was pre safety tools. And the way those kind of conversations exist. I think about the way that people make art. For me, death of the author isn't that the author doesn't matter anymore. It's the idea that they've made a thing and now it's external of them. And so it's up to like where we are and how we interact with the piece of art that like is where the game resides. And that's the same with role playing because it's ephemeral and exists at the table. That's why I tend to hate lore. And I'm not just like non-canonical, I'm anti-canonical. Like the idea of something that we need to know is almost never important. The only thing that matters is the thing being said or understood or interacted with the experience, our collective hallucination, but then also like what is the game itself floating ephemerally at the table with the experiences. It's also why I hate stat blocks because they kind of don't matter. None of it matters. And so having the wall implies something that's not there. It's the wall of the holodeck that you're bumping against. So if we're far more honest and transparent about the experience, like you're able to make a more exciting game, a more dynamic game, one that is more reactive and cool and fun. Even when you're killing goblins, it makes those goblin games better, and they're not any less good or interesting. And they are as the same level of value for me in terms of like what they are and what they create.
Yeah, I think that's I think there's something interesting to the idea that. Sorry, I'm trying to organize my thoughts. I don't think that necessarily everyone has to play all games equally or something like that. But I do think, similar to the challenge of being different people at different times, I also will say as a game designer that this is a little bit perpendicular to what you're saying, but the idea that like old school D&D is not bad. There are things that can make these games better. Affordances like safety tools matter a lot. So I agree with you on that. But I think sometimes it's good to go back or return to genres you've sort of moved past, evolved past as a person, as a designer, and or try things that are totally new. Just because.
Jump in for a second to clarify, because I love the word evolution. Because evolution sometimes it thinks like growth. Evolution doesn't mean growth; it means change. So there's not a lack of value judgment. And so evolving is totally normal and not like regressive or any way. It's. You have evolved, and that makes sense. You've changed, of course you have. Like that's part of being alive, right?
Yeah, that's why I was saying it in if it wasn't painfully obvious, like sarcasm quotes, right? Like not like
which is why I wanted to jump in with earnesty quotes
past these things because they're still fun, and they may play different roles in our lives. The older we get, like we may be less interested in just rolling dice to see how many goblins we kill, how quickly, but they're still fun and they're still there. And they're still tools for telling stories. But I was just saying, I think there's a good reason to sort of jump in and out of different games and not only play the things you've defined as the best or whatever, because it does force you to bring your own self and your own design sensibilities into a totally new space and interact with that space. To say nothing of the people, of the social experiences, but even just purely, sort of agnostic of who that is, you're going to approach those things differently because you've changed over time, right? Because we all evolve. And to your point, evolution is not teleological. To use the big, it's not going in a direction. It's just kind of vibing. It's kind of vibing.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
It's all about the vibes, whether it's fall vibes or evolutionary vibes or
surrealist body horror
vibes. Body horror vibes. Yeah, I mean, I love that.
Yeah, the thing I've found in games that claim to be surrealist is that they're still trying to follow rules, and the idea of like what it is a reflection of the artist, which is why when I was like, I'm going to do this, I'm going to use stream logic, it had to be reflective of the players, because if it wasn't, then it's just like I have images that seem unusual, but that's not really what realism is, and so trying to translate it often doesn't work. And to your point about what Lynch is and what how he creates the art that he creates. And what I find is that there's a lot of stereotypes that occur about it. I vividly remember going to a one act in a play in college that claimed to be Lynchian, and I was like, oh, it's like a greatest hits. It was like the backwards talking, and it was two women making out, and it was like intense light, and I'm like, this sucks. This sucks a lot. This isn't why I like it. Because when I think about Lynch, I think about how hard I laugh at like the characters like being odd, sitting and having dinner in like a Razorhead. Like there's so much release of humor that I think is there too. To your point about like the Midwesternness and like how it's just thoroughly him, right? And so if we're gonna make games about those things, like they should reflect the people playing it because it's just floating there in the middle of the table.
Yeah, totally. And to go back and like be even before Lynch, like you could follow any of these threads. I just happen to be stuck on this one, but like Kafka,
great.
right? Kafka similarly. I think people throw around the word Kafkan and they think about dystopia or something like that. But it's actually that dry humorism, the dry legalism. The fact the stories are about many types of things. They're about technology. They're about America. They're about China. They're not all. It's like people get sort of stuck in these stereotypical visions of things, and I know I do, and we do. I think probably both do on the show a little bit, just making fun of D&D because it's the big boy. Like it's kind of okay to make fun of D&D if you're an indie game.
And it'll be fine before, it'll be fine after.
Our
if it's for you or not, like it doesn't, if it's fun to do, or if it's for your fans, they're like, get them, boys.
Yeah, but I don't think that our opinions are going to change Hasbro's stock options at all. But yeah,
it'll
fair
still
game.
be fun to play. You know what I mean? That's always it'll still be fun. Whatever.
Yeah, but no, I think it's so reflective of what people play. Like, if we really want to break down what my issues as a system 5e is and why it does the things that like frustrate me as a designer, that's a different conversation from like. Again, it's so personal. Like for me, I'm always a little hesitant because, look at any kind of media, regardless if it's a role-playing game or not. The clear connection is I don't like this thing, and then the reaction many people have is, well, this thing is me, or I like this thing, so then if that thing is bad, I am bad. And then you have Star Wars. Like that's this is how we get Star Wars. Like you can't get rid of that. Now we have Star Wars forever. So it's that kind of thing with role playing as well. Like I don't have a dog in that fight, and I've talked with people grumpily about why I think 5e is like it wants to be simple, but it's not simple, and that's the problem. That's a different conversation, but it's hard to have those things and kind of purse them out.
Yeah. Well, I think, Graham, we're definitely going to have you back on the show.
Yeah.
And I would really love to have you back to talk more about your ideas around supportive design. What were the other two designers you had mentioned that you were talking about?
Oh, so many.
Yes.
Such incredible. So Ryan Kahn, the one true Ryan Kahn, has an itch. I played a map destruction game of theirs they're working on this weekend, which is lovely. There was a bunch of map making games because since Quiet Year, everyone's like, oh my God, it's the big thing. But I got thoughts about Quiet Year. And so Ryan brought one, which again, he did a magic trick. We were with people who are extremely famous off the books past midnight, playing in one little room, people who are way, way, way more famous than me. And Ryan took them under a spell. He's a brilliant person, and I'm very lucky to be his friend. So he has an itch. Check out his itch. He's working on Bug Dish, his game where you play bug chefs. And Sydney Icarus, another person who I met this past Gen Con. And they came out from Toronto to come to Metatopia for the first time. They spoke on some panels, brought their game, which is essentially like a band of blades, right? That's the Forge tag. Bands of Blades, but it's not Battlestar. It's the First War, because I watched the show 15 years ago, but there's a first war, and then there's the space, and then the show begins as the second war begins. So it's
is the first war the original Battlestar Galactica?
It could be.
I think that's how they've.
That's the impression, right?
I think that's how they've structured it. Anyway, that's completely off topic.
But yeah, that was great, and that was one of the best role-playing experiences I had in a very long time, because one person, again, this is back to Morkborg, one person at the table was a super fan of Battlestar and thus knew the ins and outs of jargon. I love Star Trek. I cannot tell you serial numbers of certain pieces of the engineware. I can be no, I think that's the episode where this thing happened. But this person played the engineer, who was well aware of all the problems mechanically of our really dense problem that we're having, but then it was all wrapped in this really important emotional core of like what we were doing. And the rest of us chose to play people of which the 3 or 4 people ahead of us had died, and we didn't know what to do. And so again, it was these micro scenes that were 2 minutes long that just felt so real because the person who was going on was frustrated, and we were attempting to look like we weren't incompetent, and you were just giggling because it was so tense and everyone was on point. Like, it was a fabulous time. So Sydney Icarus, Ryan Kahn, Jen Adcock, Price of Cole, these are all incredible designers, and I highly recommend them.
Met Sydney at Gen Con because
Killer.
Sydney was
Yeah,
playing,
Sydney's great.
I think their game is Dead Space or something like Dead Orbital.
Decaying Orbit.
Decaying Orbit, that's right.
Orbit.
Which has won plenty of awards, I'm sure, and I'm sure they would love it if you told them that they're award-winning, an award-winning designer.
We're not going to talk about awards on this show as one of those things we're not going to do. But I would like to.
It's just an in-joke because we like to tease each other and say like, "Are you award-winning person?" Because it's just awful. It's all pointless and like very good. So the people, our friends who win, we then get to tease them mercilessly about how they've been recognized as being the good ones.
Well,
how does it feel?
I think we should mention one game that could be award-winning, just because, Chris, I don't know if you know that Graham made a game called Jolene that is specifically about Jolene by Dolly Parton. But
I did not know that.
Game. So I
incredible.
feel like we should do a whole nother episode on this.
Yeah, for sure.
Love it.
I feel like
the sequel to Jolene.
I feel like there's not enough country genre role-playing games. I feel like we should amend this problem.
Yeah. I have a lot of music in all my games, and again, I hate to keep talking about Metatopia. One person's game was called Diegetic Film, and you would play a song, and then 2 other people would then narrate what the movie was. And I talked to Colin. I never met him before, but I talked to him afterwards. Like, look, all my games have music in them. This is great. I love this. Keep working on it. So
yeah. I'm just imagining. I think maybe because we've talked a little bit about the price of coal tonight, but I'm imagining like a country song RPG where it's born a coal miner's daughter, and then it's just the everyday life of a coal miner's daughter.
Done. Yeah. That's a one-pager. That's an easy throw it up on itch. Make your millions.
Well, maybe politically, it is also interesting to think about. I know a lot of leftist podcasts have been thinking this way, like how to connect up better some of the coastal DSA energy with the kind of traditional trade unions energy, where there's progressives who want to do stuff, but they're a little annoyed or just bored with like a lot of the media that comes out of more academic, like Marxist circles. And so, it's interesting to think about whole game spaces that have been just like neglected, because I feel like there are just big mega clusters of games around sort of high fantasy and like dark futurism, and I think there's so many other kinds of experiences, and I think, Graham, that's one reason I wanted to have you on, is I knew it'd be a good conversation because you're thinking about other kinds of experiences, right? Other things to model and simulate and mess with. So I've never thought of a country game, and I would probably not be the one to make it. But Chris, I think you should.
It's great. So Love for the Love Gods is me again commenting on both like heteronormativity and making queer romance boring and banal. The way that like we're used to these kinds of things, they're not tragic because queer romance is inherently always tragic. That's the way that it exists in media. There isn't just like a nice thing that's like a Hallmark movie where you're like, it's so outside your scope that it's no longer interesting to look at, right? And so playing with those ideas, and then going around and seeing that like Regency games are getting bigger and bigger, which I love. And then Alex White, who is an English designer, brought completely apropos of nothing, brought their sort of romance book, and so we're all our game. And so we were sitting around in LobbyCon, which again is one of the best parts, and he's saying, I've been reading all of these romance novels that I never had before, and they're pretty fun. I'd never thought to do it before. And he's just so pleased. So like, that's the energy bringing to game design.
Oh yeah. I
love that. For sure. Well, on that note, so make country games, make games about queer love, and make games about love in general. So we're going to take care of each other. Thanks, Graham, for your time. People can find you on Itch and other places. Do you want to do...
I'm at IPR. You can get my stuff at Indie Press Revolution. I have an Itch, which is my name, Graham Gentz. And, we can talk on Blue Sky and Instagram if you're feeling spicy, and I'm under This May Be Graham.
Yes, so go argue with Graham on those platforms.
Yeah. Tell me about the stuff that really pisses you off.
Honestly, pisses you off? What grinds your gears?
What grinds your gears? The the highlight that I chased somebody down in the lobby on the last day. They said something that they hated dice pools in one game, and I was like, I need to talk to this guy. And I sat down and I was like, why do you hate dice pools? And
I
think it
hate dice
scared him.
pools, Graham. I hate dice
Well,
pools.
we can talk about it next time, because
We'll talk about it next
want to
time.
hear the shit that grinds people's gears.
You will be at PAX?
Oh yeah, PAX U.
So
Sweet.
if people listen to this, if we get this out before PAX, which I think is likely, Chris?
Yeah, we will.
I don't know. Okay, cool. But then you can find both Chris Pickett and myself and Graham Gentz and I think like 79 other thousand nerds in Philadelphia at PAX U. So we'll have a little table at Studio 2, and we'll have Tony Grasso as well, Blister Critters creator, with us. So there'll be a bunch of us. All right. Thanks. This has been Why We Roll. Any final words before I stop the stream?
No, thanks for listening. You'll find all of the links for Graham's stuff in the show notes below.
Cool. Thank you, as always, Chris. Thank you, Graham. Take
Thank
care
you
of
for
each
having
other.
me. This was awesome.
Thank you, Vex. Good night.